Let me start off by welcoming all of you to this event here at the Center for Global Development. Let me also welcome those of you who are listening and watching, and I hope participating online in this event. Just to remind you that if you are going to be tweeting, please use the hashtag CGD Talks to link it to this event. And I want us to start off by saying that actually we could talk about this topic, which is how we're going to move forward and trying to actually achieve the agenda and goals we've set for ourselves on climate at any time. But I was reflecting on it in the last day once we'd had the opportunity to set up this event, and it seems to me that there's a little bit of a tipping point now. So over the last year, both in terms of grassroots movements, young people everywhere, whether it's the Extinction Rebellion or other groups of young people, and in terms of the engagement of policymakers, not just from within the environment community, but policymakers, central bank governors. So now there is a group of almost 36 central bank governors that have created a network for the greening of the financial system. Now you have, most recently, a group of 20 finance ministers that have come together to create a coalition of finance ministers to promote that agenda at the spring meetings. You have the One Planet agenda that is being promoted by President Macron, which has a big international attempt to try and link this to the G7 and then to the UN summit list. Yeah, exactly. And so there are, I think there is some, on any topic, there is a moment when it shifts from being a sort of specialized concern to being a mainstream concern. And I think that moment is now for this topic. So what better time to organize a conversation? Of course, what better a group of people to organize this conversation with? And I'm not going to introduce any of them because it would be a travesty to all the people in this room for me to say who these people are. I'm going to go straight into that conversation. I want to sort of say that the trigger for it is really this paper that has been produced by the IMF, which looks at fiscal policies for climate change. And I want to acknowledge also the presence of Vitor Gaspar sitting in the front row here as the department in the IMF that has been responsible for a lot of this work and under the leadership of Christine Lagarde. So maybe the best way for us to start would be really, I think, pick up a bit from what I was just saying earlier and turn to you, Christine. You know, I was going to say, what do you think of the nature of this challenge? Then you and Vitor beat me to it this morning with your blog, where the first sentence of your blog is, climate change is the greatest existential challenge of our times. So that's, I mean, that kind of says it, right? So my question to you really is, I think most people in this room would accept it. There are probably still some out there who are not quite sure. How do you see that agenda moving forward? And in particular, what this paper so nicely shows is that to make progress, carbon pricing in different ways, including energy subsidies, which are sort of one dimension of carbon pricing or mispricing, is a big way for us to make progress. How do you see the prospects for us to actually make progress on that agenda?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank CGD and you in particular, Masood, for taking this topic, and I'm thrilled. I think we are all three really thrilled that you would do that. Number two, you are correct that this paper, which I will flag as well myself, has been produced and released today. under the leadership of Vitor, but the real author is in front of us, Jan Perry, who is really our activist inside the IMF, and I want to recognize him and acknowledge his efforts for producing a really quality paper, and you know how the IMF works. I would like to also recognize Sanjeev, who was with FAD, with the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, and who was himself an activist on that particular front.
And who is now wisely migrated to CGD, I should say.
You know, you have to expand, and talents move, and that is great, and we celebrate our partnership, as you know that. One little caveat that I would like to mention is, I don't think that this particular concern is new, and I still vividly remember President Chirac attending I think it was the Rio conference, at which he said, it was 17 years ago, if I recall, he said, the house is burning and we are turning our back.
Yes.
So there was at a relatively high level that concern already so many years ago. And then what happened is not a lot. And I think one of the reasons not a lot happened until 2015, other than at grassroots level, at CSO level, but not so much, because I remember trying to bring finance ministers together, and there was relatively limited interest. Why? Because there was a great financial crisis, and because everybody was focused on trying to just maintain the system and keep it afloat. So the really deep concern that everybody should have continued to have about the environment, climate change, the consequences that it has on us, were in a way on the back burner during that period of time. So it's very welcome that it is now very vividly coming to the front again, and I hope that there will be no other financial crisis to distract our attention to what is an existential threat. And many of the things that we are debating, whether it is debt sustainability, whether it's structural reforms, whether it's fighting inequalities, including women in the workplace, all those that are critical topics that we study hard at the IMF, will be meaningless if in 20 years' time, essentially, we've wasted the small window of opportunity that we have to actually take those steps that are very well summarized in one of the charts that I will try to flag for you, which is quite an obscure one, but when you start putting your mind to it, it explains to you what the goals are, what the ambitions are, what will be reached in terms of ambitions if carbon price is at $35 per ton, or if carbon price is at $70 per ton. And you realize very quickly that if quick action is not taken, then there is no chance that we're going to keep the warming of our planet at less than 2%. So that's the reason we regard it as existential, critically important, and warranting this plea that this paper produces very well for what we think is the most efficient, the most expeditious way to deal with that, which is carbon pricing.
So we'll come to carbon pricing in a minute, I think. But maybe just ask Andrew a question first, which is, Sajid, there's been, over the last year, also new science, or at least there's reports come out. And I mean, for me, a simple way to think about it is that over the next 20 years or so, the world economy is going to be about twice as large. And we want the absolute level of emissions to be about a third less than they are today to be able to reach that goal. And I think there's a very nice chart in this paper, actually, that shows that. So my question to you, Andres, you've been thinking, WRI, been thinking a lot about this. Is this even possible now? And also, alongside pricing, there are a lot of political and other issues that are coming up with the implementation of this agenda. From your perspective, how do you see us making progress towards this goal that looks so ambitious?
Well, thank you, Masood, for hosting this. Christine, congratulations. This is really a great gift to the world, actually, and we need more activists within the IMF and elsewhere. So thank you very much. I had the pleasure of seeing Christine Lagarde last week in Beijing, where for an IMF leader to talk about sustainability of the Belt and Road wasn't just about debt sustainability. It was about environmental sustainability. And my goodness me, thank you very much. So yes, there's been a lot of new science in the last year, obviously most dramatically the IPCC report, which basically said, look, we've been aiming for a 2-degree warming, but actually 2-degree warming will mean you lose 95% of the coral reefs in the world. And a fact like that, and by the way, everyone was saying, if only we could get to 2 degrees, that would be fantastic, because we're currently on a path to 3.5 to 4 degrees. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could do 2 degrees? Well, yes, it would, if you want to say goodbye to all the coral reefs in the world and many, many other such data. So they said, actually, let's look at 1.5 degrees, which is what the Paris deal, remember, it was well below 2 degrees. It's not 1.5, 2 degrees, it's well below 2 degrees. And so they looked at that. And I think that was an incredibly important turning point, because it basically said 1.5 degrees is necessary, and it can be done. And organizations like ours, and I'm sure Ngozi would talk about the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, have been working very hard, so is the IMF and the World Bank, on is it possible to get from there to here? And the answer is yes, it is possible, from here to there, rather. But it's exceedingly difficult. It requires a transformation the like of which the world has never seen. Now, yesterday, the United Kingdom Parliament declared a state of climate emergency. Yesterday, the Climate Change Commission of the United Kingdom, which is a legal entity set up under the climate change law, said we can decarbonize fully by 2050. We are going to pressure the government to do that. Here is what will be required. We will need a 10-fold increase in offshore wind. We will have to go from 1/5 of 1% electric vehicles today to 95% electric vehicles by 2050. Perfectly doable, but there are such rigidities and inertias in the system that actually it will be very, very hard to do it. And that's why we need the help of all players, including ministers of finance, including the financial sector, both of whom now are starting to move in the right direction. Yesterday I was in Fiji at the IMF, the ADB annual meetings, and I was asked to address the Pacific governors, and those are the ministers of finance of the 14 Pacific Island countries. And I told them if there's one document they have to read and get their staff to read it, it's yours. Even though it was embargoed until today, I still told them what was in it. And my goodness me, interesting thing. So in Fiji itself, the entire climate change ministry is inside the Ministry of Finance. Why? Because it's that important, exactly along. It's macro sensitive, it's macro threatening. And so we absolutely need to do it. So can we do it? Yes. Are we heading towards doing it? No. Should we be encouraged about some things? Yes. We all need to push in our areas of interest. And starting with this fiscal policy is so important.
And I think the one term that you used, Andrew, which, for people who are in or off the fund is very important, is this macro criticality. Because, there is now no doubt in my mind that for most countries and for the international financial and economic system, action or lack of action on climate is macro critical. So it becomes an issue of relevance to finance and to the mandate of the fund from that agenda as well. And Ngozi, I just want to come to you and ask you a bit from your perspective now, as Andrew said, of the commission, the new climate economy report. There is this transformation that we're talking about, because it's not just a question of doing less, it's about transforming the whole nature of our economic and financial system. And many people see it as a constraint. But in fact, one of the things that was really encouraging to me in the report and in the work that your commission has been doing is the opportunities that come from this transformation. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about how you see that agenda. And you've also written about how carbon pricing should be an impetus for development in Africa rather than a constraint on development. So just linking those two thoughts together.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having this. And like Andrew and Masood said, Christine, congratulations on a very clear report. It's wonderful to see the IMF say that climate is macro-critical because it has consequences when you make that remark. But coming to what you said, on the new climate economy, I think one of the things that people were struggling with, and still are to some extent, is this issue of a trade-off between growth and low carbon development. And people had thought that, okay, if you have to move to a low carbon pathway for your development, that means you're giving up on growth. And what the work on the new climate economy has said, is really captured in the words better growth, better climate. That you can do both, that there are pathways to doing this, and that this gives us a new kind of economy that we should be looking at. And this work shows that with bold climate action, we can actually add between now and 2030, $26 trillion of benefits to the economy, create a massive amount of jobs, 65 million jobs, and avert, for instance, 700,000 premature deaths. So these are really big numbers. And we can do it through action in various ways, through land use, through action on cities, through resilient and better transport systems. There are specific actions that we can take. And a country like Indonesia has even modeled how to do this, included this in its planning process, and shows that with bold climate action, it can still grow at about 6% per year up to 2045 and cut emissions by 43%. So the work of the new Climate Commission shows that we don't have to have this trade-off. We can do it. That's the first point. The second point, you alluded to the article I wrote on carbon pricing for African countries. I think I was moved to do that because, African countries and your work, this paper shows, have contributed and contribute minimally to emissions. So they often ask the question, why should we even act? Why should we do anything about it? Just to give you a couple of numbers that you cite, which I think are telling. Between 2017 to 2030, the projected emissions of sub-Saharan African countries is 6 million tons of CO2. In contrast, China is expected to emit about 3.9 billion tons, and India 1.5 billion tons. Just compare, which means that they contribute really minimally. So they're asking, why should we care about carbon pricing and all these things? But whilst they may not be contributing, they bear the brunt. Low-income countries, and African countries in particular, bear the brunt of the actions of this high-carbon development pathway. And your blog, Christine, today shows that. I think there's a map that, if you look very clearly, shows which countries are bearing the brunt. We've just seen what happened in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and how we've had Cyclone Ida, we've had Cyclone Kenneth, there's one pounding the Indian coast right now. So they're bearing the brunt. So the thought is, how can we have to adapt. We have to build resilient infrastructure. In Africa, we need about $90 to $130 billion a year in order to get the kind of resilient infrastructure we need. But where will this come from? And there are two things that are very attractive about this carbon pricing issue. First, if we can establish an international floor price, is it $35 a ton or whatever, some of the revenues raised could be directed to the low-income countries in order to help them to build a resilient infrastructure and adapt in other ways. Second, these countries also need to raise revenues themselves. And carbon pricing is an attractive way, or, removing the distortion in energy subsidies that are there, could be an attractive way to generate resources with which to finance this resilient infrastructure. So I'm saying, let us use it. That's the first point. Very quickly, the second point is we are well endowed. Africa is endowed with good wind, solar, geothermal, all the things, the renewables. And so, but we have to provide a level playing field in order for the right signals to be given to develop those renewables. And so, if we phase out distorting subsidies, if we put in carbon pricing, that could also help send the right signals for us to use these abundant resources which we have. And we certainly don't want to be in a situation where we are trapped with stranded assets, whilst the rest of the world is moving forward with new technology, with renewables, and we are caught with the old ways of doing business. So, so for those reasons, I think I wrote that carbon pricing could help us actually drive our development, help us set an example for the rest of the world, and not hinder us.
So I do want to say a little bit about, I think, maybe your views on how we move forward with getting towards the right carbon price. So, how do we build that political support for it? And alongside it, are there other things that could be done that would try to achieve the same objective? And I'm thinking in particular of the fact that a lot of investment decisions on infrastructure are being made in the public sector. You've just come back from Beijing, and you were both talking about making sure that the choices that were being made in the implementation of BRI were more sustainable from that climate perspective as well as others. So how do you see the complementarity or the role of carbon pricing on the one hand, but also of other regulations and policies that could complement it, including those in the financial sector that we talked about?
I think I would first of all look at two key areas, one of which, by the way, is covered by another paper, which I don't know whether it is published today, but it's a fascinating one, which gives you an estimate of the global fossil fuel subsidies around the world. And it's quite disappointing in a way, because this is the most recent assessment that we could produce, and it's very similar to the one that we produced about 5 years ago. So it shows that in terms of subsidies provided by governments to population, whether households or corporates, the volume is still the same. And that amount is significant. We're talking about 6.5% of global GDP, which is subsidizing the use of fossil fuel. And this paper costs the direct and the indirect consequences of it. So it includes also the death by result of pollution caused by congestion of traffic and all the rest of it. So it's not that tentative as an assessment, but it's mind-boggling that we have not been able yet to move very much. So that's number one. That should be really target number one. And one of the ways to deal with it is clearly to put in place a carbon tax mechanism, which is relatively easy to introduce. There are many, many countries around the world that have a degree of taxation on any of the fossil fuel energies, ranging from butane to gas oil to gas, and to price it right. And that's where it becomes difficult, because when you look around, there are about 50 countries that currently have a carbon tax mechanism in place. Unfortunately, the average price for the ton of CO2 is in the range of $2. And what we are looking at is a target that should be $35. And there are multiple studies. Ours says $35 in order to limit at 3% for the G20 countries. So that's way too much, because my dear corals that I love to dive over and in will have been gone. So we need to do more than that. And I think the range that we're looking at is anywhere between $40 and $80 per ton of CO2 in order to reach the target of 2%, where still 95% of the corals are dead. So we need to do even more than that. How to do it is something that the paper actually explores. And what kind of communication, what kind of gradual introduction, what kind of public endorsement is needed, how you will present the scheme in such a way that people feel that the money that is taken away by virtue of price increases will actually find its way back into either their pocket, which is one option, or into alternative energies, or into particular schemes to encourage the use of electric cars, for instance, provided that we find a way to deal with the batteries, which is not a given yet. So it is difficult, I come from a country which has tried to introduce it recently, where this has fueled public anxiety and fueled anger because, it was a sacrifice for many people, which could not be compensated by alternative cash transfers of any sorts, and where part of the saved revenue would have been affected to other things than the welfare of the people who were suffering. So we should not assume for a second that it is easy. It's actually hard. I would say third is, sort of dealing with the subsidies issue, addressing the carbon tax and the pricing that goes with it. And I would say finally that the initiative that you mentioned about the central bank governors led by the Bank of England, the Banque de France, and the PBOC in China is really interesting, because you have 36 central bank governors around the world who have joined forces to say, watch out, climate change is a financial stability risk. Now, when you're a bank, when you're a financial institution, and you hear your central bank governor announce that, that should lead you, bank, to re-examine your provision policies, your loan policies, the asset valuations that you have, and the assessment of the loans that you're giving to your clients. So things change and will continue to change as a result. When you look at the number of green bonds that are being issued and the determination of many banks now to go green, bless them, let them continue. I think it's minimal and marginal for some of them for the moment, but it's spreading. And when we used to think that there was a risk premium associated with green bonds and green finance, which was bound to provide less return than normal investment, this is gone. The risk premium is on the brown investment, not on the green investment. So those are three channels where clearly the financial sphere and the finance ministers, and I think there are 70 of them who have joined the coalition of finance ministers when there was a meeting convened by the World Bank, which is really a blessing. But things are now beginning to move seriously, I think.
No, I think when the central bankers, the regulators, start saying to the banks that you need to take this into account, it becomes more than an exhortation. I mean, it's actually something, as you say, they have to begin to do from their compliance point of view down the road as well. Andrew, any thoughts on how we take this agenda forward?
Well, one of the things I really liked about this report is that it looks at carbon pricing from the standpoint of economic efficiency and also incidence on who gets hurt. And you've got to look at both of them, and some quite sort of counterintuitive ideas. So, for example, the current conservative case for a carbon dividend, which is going to take the revenue and put it back per capita, is found to be actually less efficient for the economy and more costly for the economy than if you, in fact, took that revenue and used it to reduce more distortionary policies. And that's the sort of thing a finance ministry needs to be able to analyze, and many, I think, are not analyzing that very carefully. It also brings up the case that doing it in a politically acceptable way may not lead to the most efficient outcome, but it may be necessary to do that. But on the incident side as well, I mean, it's terribly important to know who's going to get hurt. Now, I'm sure when you were Minister of Finance, you would have done it quite differently in France. But what we ought to tell the French government is to read the IMF report you did a couple of years ago, where you reviewed 120 cases of fuel price increases, and you showed that of that number, about a third of them were successful, and we know why they were successful, and we know why those were failed. And it's all to do with whether or not you take care to understand the bottom 1/3 of the population. I was head of the World Bank in Indonesia when Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono needed to increase fuel prices by 70%. And he said to his cabinet, he said, I'll do it, but only if you can show me that the real income of the bottom 1/3 of the population doesn't decline. And so they asked us and the IMF, what could you do? We brought in experts from Mexico, Brazil on conditional and unconditional cash transfers. We looked at their system, and 6 months later, they were able to increase taxes and increase price by 70% and rebate to the bottom 1/3 And we were able to demonstrate that real incomes didn't decline, went through politically but very few countries are still doing that. And I would recommend, by the way, that you update that each year, because there's so much more evidence coming along from that.
Right.
Now, truth be told, I tried when I was finance minister and I failed. Yeah.
I think Ngozi did the same, actually.
It just didn't work.
We did.
And I think there's an issue about perception. I think the use of words matters enormously. If we keep using carbon taxation, I'm not sure that it's the right packaging or marketing for something that most people, if you ask them, will actually validate, endorse, and agree with. But the moment you move to the sort of tax bucket, nobody wants to endorse it.
I must say, I'm also myself becoming less and less theological about the notion of not linking revenues to earmarking of revenues, because I think sometimes from a political point of view, it's necessary to be able to link the revenues to some particular cause. And while, all of us who have had some fiscal training, and I can see that Vito's getting a little uncomfortable now, would sort of say there are many problems going down this road. Sometimes it may be that road or a dead end, And so, Ngozi, you were a finance minister. I mean, you've done so many things in your life, but you were also a finance minister for a while, twice. And so you tried to put in place some of these difficult things. What lesson did you draw that, you can share, that we can put into the next version of the case studies?
Finance minister for 7 years.
Yes.
It's a long time. I totally share what has been said before, but I think in thinking through these, how we put in carbon taxes or remove distortionary subsidies and so on, we really have to look at the political economy of each country separately, because underlying conditions differ in each. But one thing I can say, and it's become worse, is that trust in government has worsened across the board in all countries. The trust people have that their government is really acting in their interest has worsened. And I think all the barometers show that. And that is because of this neglect of, the impact of globalization and so on the working class in developed countries, and of course the inequalities in developing countries within countries. So trust means that when you're going to take this kind of action, you have to be really transparent and to communicate well. We tried to do it because it was just fiscally unsustainable for the budget to have $11 to $13 billion, 3 to 5% of GDP in subsidies. And we had partial success, phase out 50%, but we tried to do 100% at a go. And I think that was part of the issue, the ambition. And so we had people on the streets, they were protesting because they felt this is the one benefit we get from oil, from this government, and these people we don't trust. If they phase it out, how do we know they're going to use the money for us? And I wish we'd been able to do it all, but with the protests, we did 50%. And today, my country still has fiscally unsustainable subsidies. But the lesson we learned are those that I think we shouldn't get too drowned and caught up in the fact that we can't do it, because there are some successes. We need to really study, one, how do we communicate that people at the bottom end of the ladder are not going to get hurt, and demonstrate up front that the resources that are phased out will be used for their benefit, for programs they care about. I think that's the number one. Two, it might be that we phase this kind of action, either phasing out the subsidies or phasing in the taxation, more gradually. So that's another lesson learned. And, communicating with the people, being careful to mark out who are winners and losers so that the winners are aware they are winners and can back you, because sometimes they are not. I think these are some of the elements we need to look at. And like you said, Indonesia was able to do something at that particular time. We were partially successful. I wouldn't call it a complete failure because we took out $6 billion in subsidies. That's a lot. And I think Colombia and a few other countries, and so we know what to do and how to do it, and we should just be careful in approach.
I want to I'm sure many people in the room have views, but before we get to that, there's just one other issue that I wanted to raise, which is now coming back to the role of the fund. Because, of course, this is a paper that talks about an issue, but it also talks about what the IMF can do in this regard. And you have set out some ideas in here about the things that the fund can do, both in terms of producing this kind of analysis, which we should recognize as being a global good in its own right, but also then using this analysis in the surveillance that the fund does, in the program work that the fund does, and how systematically it's able to roll that out. So we might spend a few minutes getting your thoughts on sort of how you see now the fund as in its operational work taking forward this agenda, and then whether there are ways in which it could do more but is being held back for one reason or the other. Or is there support for it? Do people recognize that the fund should be playing the role that this paper lays out?
Well, we often hear the questioning on the part of some who say that there are core activities and non-core activities, and anything having to do with climate change is a bit non-core, so why should we be concerned about that? I think we're almost past that stage. And I think that both at board level and finance ministers level, there is a realization that climate change issues and consequences are macro-critical in most instances. And I think that, when we do our surveillance work, for instance, we're not going to review, you will not find a chapter or a box, as we call it, that will deal with climate change issues, consequences, measures, and policy recommendations. Not in all of them, but certainly there will be a number of countries where it's unequivocally macro-critical, and where, as part of its surveillance mission, the fund and the Fiscal Affairs Department will actually look into the measures that can be taken and the policies that we can recommend that will address climate change consequences. I think that's one. Second, when we partner with a country under a program, there again, our job is to identify generally fiscal space and create some of it, to reduce spending, to raise revenue, and to see that it is put to best possible use. Clearly, there will be a climate change concern dimension in the recommendations that we give to countries under programs with which we have a bit more traction. There's also work that we do, in particular in relation to countries that are prone to natural disasters on a repeated basis. And I think that Mozambique is a clear case in point in the very recent history of one cyclone after the other hitting the country. There are also lots of, the likes of Belize, of the Seychelles, of Grenada, where we are doing, together with the World Bank, some climate change specific mitigation plans so that they can prepare ahead of time and they can anticipate the consequences of potential climate change devastating circumstances. So in all three dimensions of the work that we do, we can include the climate change dimension of policy advice, program recommendations, and anticipation by specific program for those that are most exposed.
Is there anything else that we want the fund to do? So, Ngozi, you've got you. So, what's the wish list here? Come on.
Oh, and I keep raising my voice all the time.
No, it's. I want to add one thing for emphasis. I think one of the things the fund and Christine is doing, and the fund can do more, is really insist on the urgency. The urgency, because I think still many people don't realize. We're sitting here talking. If you look at the nationally intended contributions for the Paris climate, as Andrew said, if we do that, we're all going to end up at 3 degrees centigrade. And that's just not acceptable. So the urgency to get to 2 degrees and 1.5, you can, the fund really speaking about this. The other thing is scale. that the actions we need, and this is what the new climate economy report also talks about a lot, the urgency and scale, the need to emphasize that. The second thing is, I would really like the fund to work with the bank and the other MDBs to emphasize finance for the low-income countries. The world is not coming true to its pledge. By 2020, they said $100 billion would be mobilized for adaptation for purposes for low-income countries. And we are not seeing how that is going to happen. So this is really, really urgent. So lend a voice to that.
So, Andrea, I'm just going to come to you, but I do want to say that I think in a way, if you look at the other report you mentioned, the energy subsidies report, and the point you made that actually we haven't advanced a whole lot over the last 4 years, or I think that was when the last one was done. I think that is a key finding, probably even more so to me than the actual number of 5.5 or 6 and some trillion dollars. So the fact that it's not changing is not good for the urgency point. And on the finance, if I could add a footnote, which is that I think our finance conversation for low-income countries in particular has to shift from a conversation of how it's not adding up, which is true, because you've got the debt sustainability issues that you run into each time you try and do anything. But to say, and then what? I think we now need to have the next bit of the conversation on low-income country finance, which is, and so what can we do to actually make these ends that we want achieve them? And I think that's the sort of the bit that we still have to get into, because a lot of the international conversation on finance right now is sort of unrealistic plans on one side and realism on the other. And I mean, I'm personally quite guilty of this, sort of talking about the realism. But now I think we need to sort of say, well, and then where do we go from here? So I agree very much with that point.
But on that particular point, again, the Fiscal Affairs Department has done a great job at costing what it will take to deliver on 5 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And it's monumental. It's $500 billion only for 5 of the 17. And there is no way, even with the best domestic revenue mobilization in the world, and many, particularly sub-Saharan African countries, are way below the standards where they could and should be. But there's no way that will be sufficient. So we need multiple sources. We need the donors' aid to continue. We need the private sector to be involved. We need the international institution to participate. And we absolutely need the countries to themselves decide that they're going to be with it and to raise revenue. And certainly from our perspective, you're asking me what we're doing. We are also trying to raise our voice on behalf of countries that are not very represented in order to reform the international tax system. And we have our tax expert here, Mick Keynes, in order to make sure that low-income countries, including those that have extractive industries, actually get their fair share of the taxation that they should have. There is annually $200 billion that leave their table, which should be used in order to reach some of those Sustainable Development Goals.
Absolutely. Andrew, what would you like from the ad?
Well, I think the problem is the more you deliver, the more will be expected of you. When you speak, people listen. You are dead right that we've now crossed that tipping point. I mean, nobody could say that this is not macro critical. I mean, if 1,000 CEOs that go to Davos every year say this is the #1 risk we as commercial leaders face, more than cybercrime, more than terrorism, more than recession, more than trade wars, it is the risk from climate change. We can't any longer say this is not significant. It is massively significant. Now, in terms of the IMF, you've done some terrific work in some of your Article 4. That should become the norm as opposed to a special case. Now, there could be cases where you say we don't want to make this a big deal, but I would say that we're now at the stage this has to be embedded in everything. I think as your fiscal team have sort of led the charge, there are probably other parts of the fund that ought to do just as much, including the finance part. And on the fiscal side, I would say the next sort of big piece of work is on, you have this very interesting section here on adaptation. And I would say there's more to be done there. It's not just these Pacific Islands. I mean, it's African countries, it's most countries. You think how difficult it is to be a Minister of Finance. You've got to think, do I spend scarce money now trying to move people or protect people? Or do I instead put some money in a contingency so that if I get into a crisis, I can dispose it? How do I use insurance?
Yes, do I buy insurance?
Do I buy insurance?
Yeah.
How do I manage risks? How do I balance today and tomorrow? What we've just done is put at the World Resource Institute, we put specialists in a number of finance ministries around the world, one of which is India, one of which is Fiji, sort of the other end of the spectrum. And a country like Fiji, back to the sort of psychology, what they've said is, look, we can't just raise more taxes, but they established something called an Environment and Climate Assessment Levy. And every year now, every 6 months, they bring out, what are they spending the money on? And it's not for poor people, it's for people that stay at hotels. A lot of tourists pay this, and the rich people pay it. And every 6 months, they're told, so this is what we spend it on. We spend it on some early warning radar systems. And people say, I don't mind giving money for that. And they list it in a way like that. That's the kind of thing that needs to be embedded in the kind of expenditure side of fiscal policy. So we'd love to work with you on that as your next blockbuster.
So now we have two items for our next session that we're going to do in a year's time. So one will be the updated with the blockbuster on fiscal, and the other is what I'm also hoping for is sort of parallel paper, which is on monetary and financial sector policies that will help to advance us in that same agenda. Because as we're discussing now, there are many things that you can do that would help to advance it by working through the financial system. So that's obviously another area where the fund has a big role to play. Let me now open it up, because I'm sure there are people now. Let's see, how many, can we just have a show of hands of people who are sort of interested in asking questions, and that will guide me for that. So, okay, so I have a lady right in the back there, and then we'll try and take 3 or 4 questions. Actually, I might take 5, and then we'll come back to it. So, lady in the back there, yeah, please. Could you identify yourself?
Thank you very much. My name is Margaret Hansbrough. I work for a group called Mighty Earth. We work to protect the environment and fight climate change around the world. I was very encouraged to see on page 21 of the report the mention of using essentially forest offsets as carbon storage. This is something that we started to see in the Energy Transitions Commission report, a specific mention of that, and we started to see companies voluntarily do that. Could each of you maybe talk more about, maybe even before a carbon tax from a policy perspective were to be implemented, these forest offsets as carbon storage could be used as a voluntary mechanism for companies to begin complying, begin to absorbing that carbon price, and begin to both protect and grow forest assets around the world.
Okay, forest offset, second one right in the middle here.
Jan?
Yes, I'm John Strand from the World Bank. I have just one issue. There's a number of important issues here to discuss, but I have one issue, goes directly to the topic of the presentation here, fiscal policy tools to protect our planet. There hasn't been that much about that. And my point is that if you look at carbon pricing schemes, you have sort of 2 main alternatives. One is carbon taxes, the other is offset schemes. What's been proposed mainly with the Paris Agreement is offset schemes of different types. And in that case, you have probably much less potential for raising fiscal revenue. So carbon tax would be a much more efficient way to do that. And I'd like to have our panelists to discuss on that issue.
Thank you. There's a lady sitting in the middle right here. I'll come to next. Right here, second row. Yep. Sorry, didn't you have your hand up? Okay.
Yes, my name is Valentina Okaru-Bysant, and I'm a professor at Catholic University. I must confess I haven't read your report, But my question is based on the presentation, and I skimmed through and I noticed some countries were left out, and I was wondering if that was intentional. For instance, I don't see Nigeria mentioned in some of your graphs. But I also had a question regarding including the private sector and what I know the focus is on carbon tax, but I'm also asking with respect to other factors that you could include in terms of incentivizing private sector to actually be interested in reducing carbon taxes. And then I think Ngozi mentioned political economy, which is really a challenge to having this implemented. And beyond that, there are other issues of labor risk and consumer risk. So I'm asking in terms of the developmental impact of this program actually moving forward.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And there was a gentleman just over there. Thank you.
Whitney Debevoise, Smartleton Porter. Madame Lagarde, when she was asked what can the fund do, talked about in individual cases where it's macro critical, you can talk and raise the issue. But what about the free riders, the countries for whom today it may not be macro critical? 40 years from now, it may be macro critical, but today, what can you do?
Okay, so what about the ones that aren't macro critical now but could be? So right in the back over there.
Yes, Edward Hoyt, an independent consultant on energy and development. I'd like to turn attention to a specific case of a country that is going through a crisis right now because of its role in international oil markets. What happens to resolve that crisis will be obviously highly illustrative, and that is Venezuela. Eventually, the political transition there will conclude, and there will be an international mobilization to support its reconstruction. What are the implications of what you're talking about here for a specific case like that?
Okay, thank you. The case of Venezuela, and then the last one I'm going to ask for right now is this lady
Okay,
here.
Susan Ulbeck on the World Bank board for the Nordic Baltic countries. Thank you very much, Christine Lagarde, for macro-critical. And you mentioned the countries you're talking about when it's macro-critical. I think I would like to talk about global macro-critical. So what is it you're doing with the countries that are globally macro-critical, the big emitters?
Okay.
And I'm talking, of course, of the Article 4 consultations, but also of the Chinas and Indias.
Okay, all right. So we have. I was going to say, and where we sit. Okay, so maybe do this in reverse order. Ngozi, would you like to address any of these questions that have been raised? Private sector, free riders?
On the private sector, to talk about what Valentina spoke about, I mean, it's clear that we're not going to be able to succeed unless the private sector is part and parcel of this. And I know we've not spoken about it as much, but on all fronts, on the financing front, the sorts of amounts that we're talking about cannot work unless we are able to leverage, using the multilateral platforms, to leverage the private sector and the trillions being managed there, and somehow use those towards solving some of these problems. But on emissions itself, there's so many sectors, be it transport, aviation, housing, even shipping, where emissions are really high. And unless and until CEOs accept, and the good news is, yes, so many of them are coming together. I belong actually to a group called the B Team, which has some of the world's best-known CEOs who are coming together and talking about, there must be net zero emissions by 2050, led by Richard Branson and so on. So, the private sector is also coming to realize that this is an existential threat. So more to your point, it doesn't come out as much, but there are clearly big movements, and momentum on the private sector side that we need to harness. I'm more worried that perhaps in emerging markets and developing countries, we need to do more to bring in the private sector in those countries. With regard to your issue on labor risk and political economy, we spoke about this. I mean, it's easier said than done. We already talked about it. When you're sitting there in the hot seat, it's not easy at all. And, you know, you may misjudge where the sentiment of your population lies. So I think it's something where we really need to go deep down and dig to understand what people are feeling. But it can be done. And you just have to tailor your program accordingly. And don't let the losers take the momentum, because that's what happens in many countries where you're not careful about what are the losers going to do. They can just, you know, sort of move you out. And I know in our country, labor is very active. It's not that they are losers, but they are the ones that seize the opportunity. So you need to demonstrate to them they will not lose. And just on the issue of, just a word about other fiscal policy tools. I think it's an important point because, you know, we may not be able to use first best solutions, but the paper does talk about second best. You know, what are the sets of tools that we could move to if we cannot, you know, do the first best of carbon pricing or taxing or phasing out subsidies? And you can have, you know, specific, you can have regulation, first of all. You can decide to regulate emissions. You can decide to place specific taxes on sectors or you know, that are big emitters. They are not always the best. They may not generate the kind of revenue as a finance minister. I'm, of course, interested in where can I generate revenue. But they may offer you a politically acceptable pathway to solve the problem that is not carbon pricing or carbon taxes.
There are also the areas where, in fact, if you aren't vigilant, where lobbies are the first to try and get things reversed. Yeah. So, because they're not so visible outside, except to those who are tracking it, and then, of course, the consequences do come through.
I really agree with that, and I think that derails a lot. And it becomes a political weapon, by the way.
Yeah.
So if you're not vigilant and you're trying to do something, then it becomes... since I have the word, just one quick thing. You know, one of the things I really want to raise before we leave here that the fund could also help do is...
Hope you're planning to stay a long time in your job.
With regard to climate risk, countries do not have, many low-income countries and emerging markets even, do not have a risk management framework for climate. They just don't. So when something hits, there's nothing to fall back on. So we must, working with the World Bank and others, help them to put these frameworks in place. And there's a climate assessment paper that the fund and the bank are doing. So that really provides a good basis. And then they need a basket of tools. It's not one. It's not carbon pricing alone or one thing. They need it for adaptation. They need a basket. You know, catastrophe bonds, if that is possible. They need insurance. I think the fund paper needs to do a supplement on insurance because it didn't talk about the Pacific risk insurance, the Caribbean risk insurance, the Africa risk insurance, sovereign insurance that can help countries manage when they are hit through this adaptation. So I think those two things are quite important.
That's because we talk about those schemes in another paper.
Which
is a paper that I think is not yet published. It's on the climate resilience paper. It's covered there. And just a footnote, because I don't want to discuss it, it's not published yet. But we talk about these schemes, and we also talk about the cost of them.
Exactly.
And how by extending pooling, including to countries that would not be as prone to natural disasters, maybe we can, working with the insurance sector, try to sort of reduce the premiums, because otherwise it's just unbelievably expensive.
Sometimes they're attractive, but not economical. So, Andrew.
No, and it's been very disappointing how few countries actually are paying the premiums. on Valentina's question, without the private sector, I don't think we would have had a Paris deal, actually. I mean, they played an incredibly important role. I mean, not all of them, but enough of them now are making a real difference, including on carbon pricing, too. I mean, the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition is just one of those. But there are now 1,400 major international companies that have internal carbon pricing, and interestingly, being led by, including major Indian companies like Mahindra, for example. Quite interesting in that regard. So that's very encouraging. And the fact that, as Mark Carney says, there's now $105 trillion worth of money being managed by companies, which are private companies, that do believe that we ought to disclose climate-related risks. That in and of itself implies exactly as Ms. Lagarde was saying, that things are really changing. Margaret asked about forests and negative emissions. I mean, what we've learned in the last year, really, is that it's no longer good enough just to stop emitting. We're going to have to take a lot of carbon out of the air, equivalent probably to about 15 years of total emissions at today's rates this century. You think about that. We've got to take 15 years out. And obviously, the best form of carbon capture and storage is a tree. Soil is also good. Bushes are good. Crops are good. There are all kinds of ways that we can do this. But we may need more, as you know. I mean, so issues of so-called BECCS, carbon capture and storage, direct air carbon capture, new technology, where we're going to have to invest a lot more. You mentioned sort of offsets. I mean, we have to be very careful on this. Yes, it's good to have offsets. You and I paid 2 cents a kilowatt hour extra for my so-called green electricity, so-called a REC, a renewable energy credit, so to speak. That's good, and all of us offset, I'm sure. I hope CGD does, your travel. The problem is, though, when, for example, some industries are saying we want to offset, we have to make sure that's not an excuse to not act more strongly. So at the moment, there's a big move in the oil and gas business and some of it's very good. So Shell has just introduced on a pilot basis at the pump in Europe, you can pay extra as you get gasoline. And that's going to plant trees. So we have to be quite careful. And this year, as you know, at the COP, they will be negotiating the rules on that.
Andrew, can I just say that I think we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to give Christine the last word on that, and then
I just want to say one word to you, Christine. We are asking you to do a lot because we love you and we think you're doing a fantastic job. I don't think there are 5 people in the world that, when they speak on this subject, are more influential than you. So thank you for what you're doing.
There you go.
Thank you so much. I don't think that I'm going to deal with the Venezuela question, because I'm not sure that the critical immediate issue is going to be how climate change sensitive the rebuilding of refinery is going to be. I think that will have to come, that will have to be thought in those terms of attention to climate change and how infrastructure are made sustainable for that purpose. I think the critical issue will be humanitarian aid, and for quite a while. So I think that will be the first and foremost concern. And then the rebuilding and the sustainability concerns at the forefront of that rebuilding effort will have to be considered in due course when it's possible, and I hope soon. I just want to close with one thing, which is that you mentioned $130 trillion.
105, I think it is.
105. Yeah. I have $130 trillion in my mind, because that is the amount of assets under management that are going to be handed over in the next 5 years to the millennials. And in a way, that to me is maybe some real hope, because money is going to have to be invested in those green projects, in green finance. And if anything, millennials are more attentive, more sensitive to those issues than their parents or grandparents. So I think that finance will have to play a role, as we all each individually will have to play a role. Of course, we do the offset that you mentioned, but I was particularly pleased when we invited Sir David Attenborough to join us at the spring meeting of the IMF, to tell him later on in the day that we had banned any single use plastic item from the whole operation of the IMF. Wow. And it's by all of us, each individually and as institution, if we can do something, we also contribute in our minimal way to what is a global cause.
So let me then take this moment to thank all our panelists for this and to thank all of you for being here. So if you could join me, please, in thanking everyone for a wonderful afternoon.
Well done. Well done. Great.